I was assigned to a congregation when I was in seminary to do some learning before I was an intern, and the congregation I was at had an intern. And one day I was privileged to join him as he was leading the high school Sunday school class. He started that conversation off by asking each person to share what superpower they would have if they could pick one. And the first one said something like super strength and indestructibility, and we worked along and joked and laughed about why each one picked which one they picked. I said I would choose the Force out of the Star Wars series, and they said that's not a superpower. And I said if you can move things with your mind and get people to say what you want them to say and kind of do what you want them to do, that sounds like a superpower to me. And we debated that a bit, but eventually it came around to the last young lady, and before she answered the question, her whole body language changed. She kind of looked down and said, I would want to be invisible. Now, this intern was quite astute and punted what was planned for that day and dug deeper into her response and why she was saying that. And there were some things that she wanted to be invisible because of the way that she was being treated. Being invisible would have been a better option than being who she was in school and the ways that people were approaching her. I was 24 years old when I was assigned to a project for my consulting company with the United States Air Force, where we were replacing a decades-old data system with a new data system. And one of the things that I had been tasked with was mapping and coming up with a strategy from taking the way the data was structured in the old system and converting it into the way it would be in the new system. Very much like translating a language, right? The things were structured one way, this was different, and we had to connect all the dots and make sure the data made it across. Well, long before we actually did that work, we needed to present it to a whole group of stakeholders for the client, and that was happening in the big lobby of an office building. They set up a stage, and in front of the stage were about 50 or 60 people, most of whom were twice my age, many of whom had worked on that old data system longer than I had been alive. And it came time for me to stand up and present to this group who knew that old thing very, very well and didn't know the new thing at all, what the strategy was going to be. I had on my suit, my best suit. At 24 years old, I looked more like 16, 17, and I stepped up there fresh-faced, ready to share my strategy. And before a word came out of my mouth, someone from that crowd shouted, "Who is this kid?" And somebody else shouted, "How old is he?" And pretty soon the whole crowd was just a rabble of voices wondering what this kid was up there doing. They hadn't even heard what I had to say. I might have been right, might have been wrong. We never found out. What I did was to take a few steps slowly back as someone else came up and took over the meeting and took it in a different direction. And I slunk down in a chair, wishing very much that I was invisible on that particular day. Now, that young lady in that Sunday school class and my experience were times where, because of the way we were treated, we wanted to be invisible. But there are other times where we are invisible but want to be seen. Both of those things can happen. You may have been in situations where you were treated poorly and just wanted to be invisible, but there may have been other times where you just wanted someone to hear your voice and be seen. I think of many of you women who have been in a work environment where there was a brainstorming or a problem solving, and you voiced an idea, and it just got skipped right over, and then a man down the other end of the table said it out loud, and all of a sudden it's a great idea that he gets credit for and it gets implemented. You were treated as if you were invisible, right? You were looked past and did not get heard. I think of people of color and people whose English accent is strong because of a different language that was their first, and how often they may feel that they are unseen or unheard just because of who they are. And when we land in those places, whether it's we get treated a way that makes us want to be invisible, or we would love to be seen, but no one sees us, that can be a hard place to be. I think of the people who work in dirty, labor-heavy jobs that we should see every day, but maybe don't, and what it might feel like in some of those cases. Maybe it's okay to go unseen, but then you also want to be recognized and seen as a full human being. But for all of those times that each of us may feel like we are unseen or maybe want to be invisible, there are also people that we treat poorly or that we don't see. People that we make want to be invisible, or people who are invisible to us and just want to be seen. Who might that be for you? There might be some clues in the way you talk, like if you say those people about any particular group of people, that suggests that while you may see them, you may not treat them great, or that neighborhood. Sometimes we put the word just in front of something, like, oh, that's just the, and fill in the job that they do, right? That's discounting what they do a little bit and maybe not seeing them for the full worth that they bring, even if it's not the thing that you value the most. And I invite you to think about those times when you have felt invisible or wanted to be invisible and how that felt for you, and realize that when you don't see other people or when you treat them in a way that makes them want to be invisible, they feel that same thing. So that we end up in this sort of messy humanity where sometimes we don't treat people as fully beloved, precious children of God, and sometimes we don't get treated that way, and we end up in lots of places where not everyone feels fully human or fully free to be who they are or fully seen as who they are. The Gospel of Luke is quite clear on the people that are seen. In the second and third chapters, we get told that Tiberius was the emperor, and Pontius Pilate was the governor, and Herod was the king, and his brother Philip and Licinius and the high priests. We get told who those people are. They were the power brokers. They were the ones that mattered, if you will. But then, today we hear a different story. We hear the story of Mary, who probably was invisible to most of the people around her, right? This little inconsequential town. She's a young girl. She wasn't a person of power and worth and value to the powers that be. And so probably she went unseen until she ended up pregnant. And now she probably wanted to be invisible because, no doubt, being unmarried, she didn't get treated great once they found out the state that she was now in. And so what does she do? Well, she goes on a trip to visit Elizabeth, who she knows will see her. She knows Elizabeth will welcome her. And she walks in, and not only does Elizabeth see her, but she celebrates Mary, celebrates the baby as her Lord, and she affirms the promise that Mary has been given. She says, "Blessed are you who believed in what was spoken to you," who believed God's promise. Then Mary jumps into the song, and in the song she right away starts out and says, praise to God for blessing this lowly servant. Mary identifies herself as lowly. Just as that teenage girl in Sunday school wanted to be lowly, and that day that I felt lowly, this is where Mary says, the lowliness of your servant. She knows she was unseen and knows she maybe now wants to be invisible, and yet she sees somehow that God's promise is active in her life. And so she sings this whole song, and at the end of it, she comes back to promise again and points to the promise that was given to Abraham and the ancestors. Mary knew she was lowly, but she all in this moment feels seen by both Elizabeth, but also seen by God, who has given her this promise to live out. We've been on this Advent journey for 4 weeks now, dwelling in God's promise. First, we asked the question, who is God? And talked about steadfast love and faithfulness and mercy and compassion. These are the things that are God's character for this God who keeps promises. The second week, we said, what is the promise? And from Luke 3, verse 6, we got this promise that all flesh shall see the salvation of God. This is a big, magnificent promise. Last week, we asked the question, well, what does that mean today? We who may struggle to apply that promise to the particular people in our lives who are challenging. And we let John lead us to an understanding of generosity and a spirit of generosity being the way that that promise might come alive for us right now. Today we come to a different question. It's, well, what is the promise tomorrow? And maybe today. And Mary helps us to come at that a very particular way. You see, that big promise that all flesh shall see the salvation of God is for all flesh. But each of us is an embodiment of flesh, and each of us receives that promise perhaps in a different way because we all live in different spaces and different circumstances. For Abraham, the promise for Abraham and Sarah was that they would be, their descendants would be countless and numerous, and that they were blessed to be a blessing. That's part of the big promise, that all flesh shall see the salvation of God and be made whole and well in God's praise. But there was a particular promise for Abraham and Sarah and the descendants that followed. Mary got a visit from an angel who gave her a particular promise that she was going to bring Jesus into the world. That was a particular promise for Mary, lowly Mary. It was that lowly Mary who believed that promise and took that journey to Bethlehem and delivered Jesus. It's the same lowly Mary who lost track of Jesus when they were at the temple and had to go back and find him teaching in that space. The same lowly Mary who at the wedding in Cana looked at Jesus and said, "It's time." And he said, "No, it's not." And she said, "Yes, it is." The same lowly Mary who had to watch him be treated as less than human, to be treated more lowly than she, beaten, abused, and hung on a cross to die. The same lowly Mary who got to see him again in resurrection, but then had to say goodbye again as he was raised up in the ascension. That lowly Mary had this very particular promise. God saw her and gave her a particular promise. Different than the one for Abraham and the ancestors, but also part of that bigger promise. What that means for us is that God sees every one of us as well, and that within that bigger promise, God has a calling for each of us and a promise for each of us that meets us just where we are. Sometimes that may feel like good news and blessing. In the song that Mary sings that we heard twice today, she talks about the poor being lifted up and the rich being sent away empty, the powerful being brought down, right? And the poor and hungry filled. Being poor and hungry is a stressful way to live. There are those who spend most of the day trying to figure out how they're going to eat that day, how they're going to find shelter that day, when they might find a chance to maybe get a shower or a moment of rest and sleep. There are those who work multiple jobs and can't get away to parent-teacher conferences or even to the doctor when they don't feel well, because if they don't go to work, they lose their job and any little bit of what they're just barely holding together. These are stressful places to live, and when Mary sings this song that says, between her believing the promise and Abraham believing the promise, that the poor will be lifted up, it's a way of saying that God's promise that all flesh shall see the salvation of God means that that stress will be lifted and those people will be restored to a place of being seen and heard, not being invisible or wanting to be invisible. But there's the other half of Mary's song, and it doesn't sound like good news to all of us, that the rich and the wealthy will be either taken down or sent away empty. I would guess that Herod did not sleep well at night, he who was powerful and wealthy. We know from later on, after Christmas, about him having a whole bunch of babies killed because he felt threatened. He probably every day looked about to see who might be scheming or plotting to take him down, and probably lost a lot of sleep wondering what that next threat was. And then he had all these palaces and wealth that you got to protect and all the rest of it. That's not a healthy way to live either. And so the promise that the wealthy might be torn down and the powerful sounds maybe bad if that's who you are, except for it's also a way of freeing you from that horrible way you have lived as an authoritarian and giving you a new life as well. Being seen and heard as a full human being that's gifted and a beloved child of God, even if you haven't lived into the fullness of that. But we don't have to just talk about authoritarian despots. If you have a lot of wealth and stuff in this world relative to most of the world, there's stress in that. You worry about the housing market and the retirement funds and how are we going to take care of all these things, and the roof is now leaking, but we got to get the floor fixed, and that's our responsibility because we own this thing. And we can get wrapped up in all of that in a way, and Mary's song promises that God sees us where we are and promises to free us from our stress in those same places and make us whole as well. So that this song that's all about the leveling ultimately is this good news wherever we are, that God sees us who we are and takes us to places of new life through the death and resurrection of Jesus that gets us to a place of being whole and well and good in God's praise. This is Mary's song, that none of us is invisible, that God sees us all, and that big promise meets each of us in our particular calling. Every Sunday when we gather, we gather around this font and this table. We call these our sacraments. Sacraments, Augustine would tell us, are visible signs of God's invisible grace. So we have this visible water right here that we can see and touch. And we have the visible bread and wine that we can taste and feel. These are visible signs of God's invisible grace. And we say that these are gifts for all people, right? It is that promise that all flesh shall see the salvation of God made real right in front of us. But here's the thing. Mary got this particular promise. We get this particular promise. And it turns out that I'm not sure Augustine was right. I know it's a little bit dangerous territory to argue with Augustine, but I'm not sure God's grace is invisible. I think we actually see God's grace all the time if we are paying attention. Whenever someone offers us a gift of grace, and that could be forgiveness, it could be a helping hand, it could be a kind word in a hard day, it could be financial assistance when we're just trying to make ends meet. All of those are visible things that we can see that are also evidence of God's grace at work in the world. So that we who are God's beloved children actually are people of the promise. We are the way that God often brings the promise alive in the world, which means we are visible signs of what turns out to be visible grace. And we are gathered in these sacraments and filled up to go out in the world to bring that promise alive. And it is amazing when we get to experience that. To look at someone who hasn't eaten every day for a week and to give them a gift of food because we've been able to be the hands and feet of Jesus in that space and say, you are precious. That is a gift of grace that is visible, and it's a gift for both sides of that conversation because both people are seen. Today, we hear that Mary has a particular part of the promise of that big promise, and there is a particular part of that big promise for each and every one of us. As we go out into the world, we go knowing that God sees us, that we are beloved, precious children of God, and so are all the people that we meet. And so today, whether you feel invisible or want to be invisible, or whether you are seen and maybe seeing other people or maybe overlooking some people, in all of those places, God finds us where we are, gathers us up in the promise, and grounds us in this visible grace that we are gifted with and sends us out into the world to be those visual people of the promise that bring it alive today and tomorrow as God meets us just where we are. Amen.